Welcome everyone to Tisch College's second virtual Civic Life Lunch of the fall semester, entitled Asking Truth from Power, Reporting on the Trump White House with Yamiche Alcindor. I'm Alan Solomont, the Dean of the Tisch College of Civic Life, and it's my pleasure to kick off today's program featuring Tufts alumnus Neal Shapiro and Yamiche Alcindor. Tisch College has many virtual events scheduled this fall, including later this week. Tomorrow, we will be joined by the Mayor of Boston, Marty Walsh, Boston's Health and Human Services Chief, Marty Martinez, and its Chief Equity Officer, Dr. Carolyn Crockett. On Thursday evening, we present CNN commentator and former Green Jobs Advisor to President Obama, Van Jones. And on Friday, we host conservative political strategist Scott Jennings alongside the progressive political strategist Robbie Mook for an analysis of the first presidential debate that will take place this evening. You can find more information and register for those events at tischcollege.tufts.edu/events. Today, we are honored to host PBS White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor for a conversation on media, politics, and race. Before I hand it over to Julie Dobrow to introduce our guests, I want to thank our co-sponsors for their collaboration and partnership. Many thanks to Jumbo Vote, the Political Science Department, the Edward M. Murrow Center at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, all of whom are supporting today's program. I also want to remind folks that there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions during today's conversation. Keep an eye on the chat function for additional instructions from my Tisch colleagues. And now I am pleased to hand things over to Tisch College Senior Fellow for Media and Civic Engagement, Julie Dobrow, to introduce today's guests.
Thank you, Dean Solomont. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Neal Shapiro. Neal is an award-winning producer and media executive with a 30-year career spanning print, broadcast, cable, and online media. The CEO of WNET, the largest public media station in the country, Neal oversees the operations of Channel 13, WLIW 21, and NJTV. Neal has personally overseen the growth of WNET's original programming, nearly doubling arts and culture offerings, revitalizing local programming and community engagement. He's a regular on the fundraising circuit, complete with his suspenders, which I note are missing today, setting new fundraising records so vital for public broadcasting. Before joining WNET, Neal was president of NBC News, a position that he began exactly 1 week before the terror attacks of 9/11. Before that, Neal was executive producer of Dateline NBC, and before that, spent several years at ABC News as a writer and producer. Neal is the recipient of many awards, including 32 Emmys, 31 Edward R. Murrow Awards, and 3 Columbia DuPont Awards. But we may be most proud of Neal for being a jumbo, graduating from Tufts magna cum laude with degrees in history and political science. Neal has served on the Tufts Board of Trustees. He's been a longtime partner of mine in producing our annual Edward R. Murrow Forum on Issues in Journalism. And perhaps his latest and greatest Tufts achievement is being a Tufts parent. I'm also very pleased to introduce you to Yamiche Alcindor, who, as Alan noted, is White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour, a role she began in January of 2018. Prior to that, she was a national political reporter for the New York Times, where she covered the presidential campaigns of Donald Trump and Senator Bernie Sanders, as well as writing extensively about the impact of President Trump's policies on working class people and on people of color. Yamiche has also worked as a news reporter for USA Today, where she traveled the country covering stories ranging from the tragic school shootings in Newtown, Connecticut, to the equally tragic death of Trayvon Martin, to police protests in Ferguson, Missouri, and so many other important stories of our times. A graduate of Georgetown University, Yamiche also holds a master's degree in broadcast news and documentary from New York University. Yamiche is the recipient of many prestigious awards, including being named recipient of the Aldo Beckman Award for overall excellence in White House coverage from the White House Correspondents Association, and as of yesterday, the 2020 Gwen Ifill Award recipient named by the International Women's Media Foundations. Congratulations, Yamiche, on this latest honor. I also want to say, as someone who has taught aspiring journalists here at Tufts University for many years, Yamiche, that you are an inspiration to our students. Thank you for all that you do, for standing up for journalistic integrity in often very difficult circumstances, and for joining us today at Tisch College.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Julie and Yamiche. Welcome to the Hill, at least virtually. We're so glad you're with us. Why don't we start with what Julie just talked about, the difficulty of being a White House correspondent, which I imagine is hard during any time, but especially in the age of Donald Trump. What are the complications?
Well, I just want to say again, thank you so much for having me here and for wanting to ask me questions. These are such crazy and intense times. So I really, really don't take it for granted that you all are taking your time out to look at another screen and listen to me answer questions. So in terms of the age and reporting, it's been a tough time because obviously everything that we knew about campaign reporting, everything that we thought we knew about television reporting, everything that we thought we knew about grief and about the country really being already full of chaos has been completely upended, and it's just been more intense. So my experience during this pandemic has been really focusing so much on the foundations of journalism. I went to NYU grad school, and I think about the fact that journalism at its heart, why it was put in the Constitution, was to hold people accountable, was to seek the idea that there needed to be this sort of fourth estate that would double check all the other areas of government, all the other parts of our society, and bring that information to light. So in the middle of a pandemic, I feel like I can trust the reporting at PBS NewsHour by myself, but also by my colleagues, who are really getting at what does it mean that the president has downplayed this virus? What does it mean that Joe Biden says he could do a better job? What does that actually look like? So tonight, obviously, there's going to be the first debate, and I'm looking forward to really trying to dig in about what's been said by both candidates in terms of how they would handle this pandemic and also how they would handle race. It's no secret that President Trump has struggled more with support for African-American voters. Joe Biden has had a lot of that support, but there are still a lot of African-Americans that are looking at the Biden-Harris ticket and saying, what exactly are your plans for me? So I think as a reporter, I've been really focusing on making sure that my role is to bring all of those questions and all of that meaningfulness and resolve to the job, doing, I think, during a time that I think is the most difficult in my life and in my career.
Let's talk about him and the way he talks about reporters, because he has singled people out. He singled you out. What is that like when the President of the United States comes right after you?
Well, I should say I came from TV, as you noted, from print. So so I want to answer this question two ways, because I think there are students listening. There's the mechanics of knowing how to do your job. You were obviously president of NBC News. There's a TV correspondent's job is to make sure you're polished, to make sure you're clear, to make sure you're solid in your reporting, to make sure that the medium that you're using, which is your voice and your body, that it is something that is being used in a way that leaves the audiences with an understanding of what you came there to do in a respectful way. So the actual idea of asking questions to the president while he says you're nasty, or he says that's not what I said, I've had to learn how to fact check the president in real time, which has been a complete, I think, roller coaster in some responses and in some ways, because I've had to learn how to jump in and have facts ready. So when the president says something like, oh, I haven't left the White House in months, I can say, well, actually, Mr. President, you left on March 15th and you went to North Carolina. So that, I think, has been tough, and it's been something that I've had to get used to. And then the actual doing of the job, I think it's not lost on me, especially now, that the way that I got into journalism was civil rights. There was a young boy named Emmett Till who was murdered in 1955. His mother put his disfigured face on the cover of a magazine and opened up his casket to the world, and really that changed all sorts of people. It changed John Lewis. It inspired him to be a civil rights activist. It changed Rosa Parks. She becomes a civil rights activist because of this. The March on Washington is an anniversary of his murder. And for me in my life, solidified for me that America has real deep flaws and that we need to be focused on those flaws and need to be focused on understanding what it means that we say we are going to treat everyone equally, but don't. So I've been more resolved in that goal of mine that I had, that foundation of why I became a journalist, when I think about my back and forth with the president, because I never get personal, because I really do think that there are so many Americans that are vulnerable and are scared and that have lost their jobs, that deserve someone that is there to be their representative.
You know, in all my years, when I used to talk to White House reporters, their complaints were always things like, we don't get any access, we're being spun. There were things that normal reporters complain about, routine precedents. This seems to be a totally different atmosphere. What's the esprit de corps like in the press corps?
I think in the press corps, people are getting closer and understanding that we all are in some ways seeking the truth out together. I've made some really good friends in the press corps so that if someone asks a question and I think, wait, that question wasn't answered, I can go and ask a follow-up question. I think that the people that do the job, the people that become journalists are people that do, I think, fundamentally believe in the work in the craft of journalism. So I think there's a lot of, obviously, some frustration with the president trying to call us the enemy of the people and all that. But I think for the most part, the morale in the press corps is pretty high because I think that we are all, one, supporting each other, but also we understand that doing this job in 2020 is really chronicling life and death and asking questions that are literally life and death for so many Americans.
Let's just talk a little bit about your personal transition from print, where you have lots of time to say what you want, to broadcast, where you have less. And even in the NewsHour, where you have more time than some of the commercial broadcasts, there's still, you have to learn how to do that. Was that transition difficult for you?
It wasn't difficult for me because PBS NewsHour to me feels like the New York Times on TV. It's a smart newsroom. It's a newsroom that I feel like gives us extra time to tell stories. So some of my packages have been 8 minutes, 9 minutes. That's considered a mini documentary in some places. But for us, that could be literally my package on voting. So when I do a package on race, or I do a package on immigration, or I do a package on climate change, we can do series. There are a lot of series that PBS NewsHour do and does that we just won an Emmy. My colleague, William Braggham, for doing a series on a pandemic. That was in 2019 when we had not learned of the coronavirus. But it's that kind of reporting that I think that sets PBS aside. And long before I came to be at PBS, I was watching PBS because I like the in-depth reporting. I loved watching Frontline. I still love watching Frontline. It's probably one of my favorite forms of media because it really kind of takes you into the back rooms. That said, I'm also learning how to, we have areas in PBS NewsHour, like tonight probably, where I'm going to have 2.5 minutes to explain to people what the president's debate strategy is. And as a TV reporter, I've learned to just be very concise, to pick the most important parts of the story, and to realize that the bigger audience that I'm getting on TV, that they are an audience that wants to get information in very quick and concise manner. So I think that there's that going on. I think back to when I was making the transition to print and TV, I was covering the trial of George Zimmerman, and there was a full 8 hours worth of testimony. And I turned to my friend who was a local reporter on TV and said, there was so much, there was a scientist, there was all this stuff. How do I synthesize this for TV? And she said, today was the day where we saw the hoodie and we saw the Skittles that Trayvon Martin had in his hand. That's what the audience is going to remember from today. Yes, there was a scientist arguing about the voices on the tape and who might have been screaming, but fundamentally it's about emotion and it's about carrying people and it's about giving people something that they will remember long after your newscast. So I've had to learn that skill, and it's a skill that I think is really, really well done on TV.
So newspapers have circulation, websites have hits, we have ratings. The NewsHour has a healthy audience, not as big as CBS, NBC, or ABC. How do you think about that?
I don't think about it that much because in my mind, there's the ratings, but there's also social media. There's also the cross-pollination. So if I break a story on PBS, I've seen it pop up on other networks. Just today, I woke up to a scoop that I did, which was that President Obama put out a new video on the shaderoom.com. It's this kind of gossip celebrity news site. So I tweeted it out to my 1 million Twitter followers, and then people are possibly going to pick that up and reference our reporting. So I really think we're in this age where there's the idea that you have your one audience, but that so many people are getting that information and information that I'm reporting from so many different outlets that I hope people are coming to me, not just from turning on their TV at 6 o'clock, but that they're also seeing it through a bunch of other outlets.
How has the pandemic itself changed your professional life from the days you could actually be at the White House to now we're talking from your apartment? How's that changed?
Well, one, I used to go to the White House every day. I used to try to meet sources every single day in person. And now I just can't do that anymore. So I go to the White House 2 to 3 times a week now to try to be safe. Of course, I'm wearing a mask and social distancing and washing my hands, but it's something where I'm not face to face with a lot of my sources anymore. That has meant that sources have been more willing to call me back on the phone. I've been more willing to get on Zoom calls with people. So that's been helpful. I think for my own personal life, as someone who was married only a couple of years ago, it's helped me balance work and my married life a bit better. I was someone who got married and told my husband, my husband's also a reporter. So we kind of told each other, we're hoping that we're not going to be ships passing at night and just kind of seeing each other for 3 hours a day. But for the first year and a half of my marriage, it was really like the weekends are when we see each other, and we kind of are roommates during the week because it's just so much news. But I think now it's kind of grounded me in understanding how much family and friends and my marriage mean to me. I'm still, of course, a workaholic, but it's really important to me now to make time for my family. And that's a lesson that I think we're all in some ways sort of learning, that eating lunch with your spouse and dinner with your spouse is a great thing. Who knew?
Married to a journalist, I get it. Let's talk about the pandemic itself. It seems there's never been a topic which has been so galvanizing in a way, in which the country seems to be unable to agree, at least maybe the president and his followers, on fundamental scientific facts. What kind of a challenge is that for you as a reporter?
It's been quite a challenge because it's been quite a challenge, but it's also been par for the course in that the president ran on this idea that climate change was something that was a hoax made up by the Chinese. When he came into office, he started, of course, rolling back all sorts of environmental regulations. He's questioned science long before this. But with it being in the middle of a pandemic, I've had to constantly put everything that the president says into context. I've had to constantly be prepared to fact check the president whenever I'm at a press conference or whenever I'm asking questions of the White House press secretary. And that can be something that really, I think, adds a layer to my job. But it's, of course, been a privilege to be able to do all that. So I think in some ways I've been heartened by the idea that part of my role is explaining to people, yes, the president did downplay the virus. It's not something that I'm just saying out of nowhere subjectively. He admitted it to Bob Woodward on March 19th. When we talk about, how many young people are being impacted, the president said to Bob Woodward very clearly, plenty of young people, those were his words, plenty of young people are impacted. Then he gets in front of a crowd and says virtually no young people are impacted. So I'm constantly having to explain to people that this president is saying two different things, but the scientists are saying we should take this very, very seriously. And I think Americans, both Republicans and Democrats, while there are some, of course, fundamental differences on mask wearing, on washing your hands, on some things like that, I think fundamentally Americans understand that this is a pandemic that is threatening our lives. So I hope that in our reporting that it comes off not as adversarial, but that we are trying to keep people safe.
There's that fine line between being an adversary and putting things in context. As you know, there are newspapers now where the headline will say, Trump, not telling the truth again, right? That feels that reporters need to put that context very much in their stories. Do you feel the same way, that you constantly need to keep reminding people when he says something, I need to give you the counter evidence?
I think so, but I think it's because it's the role of journalism. The role of journalism is to focus and say, look, this is what the president said, and it's not true. And to say that over and over again if needed. So when it comes to a pandemic that is literally killing people and disproportionately killing Black and Hispanic and Latino populations, then I have to, I think, make the case that what the president's saying is wrong. Away from the pandemic, the president constantly is beating up on mail-in voting, constantly saying it's full of fraud. And I constantly, every single time I report it, say he has no evidence. He's saying that the mail-in systems are fraudulent, but he has not shown why. And when we ask the White House constantly for evidence, because I think if there was evidence of mass voter fraud, I would want to report on it. I would want to say, look, this thing in Pennsylvania is a problem. This thing in North Carolina is a problem. So I think that that's the thing. And I should say I fact check all the people that I cover. So in 2016, I covered Bernie Sanders, and people will remember possibly that there were a lot of supporters of Bernie Sanders who thought I was too hard on Bernie, who thought that I was fact checking him too much. So I've been someone who has constantly been wanting to put things into context. And I think that that's the way you do the job.
So I don't want to burn any of your sources, but when you go back to people in the White House and you say, I want your proof or how you respond to something which you believe is demonstrably not true, how do they respond to that? Either they believe it's also not true and they're towing the company line, or they sincerely believe the president. How do you reconcile that?
I reconcile it by reporting what they tell me. I reconcile that by knowing that this is an administration and the president is someone who watches a lot of the people who work for him on TV. He's very cognizant of what people are saying. So there is definitely this belief that there are a lot of White House people that are on TV understanding that they are not just answering the question for me, but that they're answering the question with the president in mind. So that's the way that I reconcile that. I just try to continue to report the facts and let the White House say what it wants to say.
Let's talk now about the other big, potentially transformational issue has been the kind of ongoing quest for racial justice. That's not a new issue, but the shift in the country, especially after George Floyd, seems profound. Do you sense it that way? Do you think it could actually be a turning point, or could we slip back where we were before?
I think it's really early to say. I definitely think that George Floyd and him dying and an officer kneeling on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds absolutely struck at the conscience of the country. But I just interviewed one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, and she pointed out that the criminal justice system has not really changed. The rates of Black people dying at the hands of police has not really changed since 2013, 2014, when Black Lives Matter first really started getting on the scene. So I think that we can talk a lot about how there are posters and more people talking about Black Lives Matter, and athletes are allowed to openly protest, but will that fundamentally change the relationship between the criminal justice system and African Americans? We just don't know.
And were you surprised by any of the president's response to this, his criticism of athletes who speak out, his attack on protesters, often peaceful protesters? Did any of that surprise you, or that felt like that's what I would expect from the president?
Well, the president has been saying the same thing for a long time. So when he was running, he ran on being a law and order president. I can't remember the first, when he started calling Black Lives Matter a terrorist organization, but he has always cast the movement for Black lives and people that were protesting the deaths of people like Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin as people who didn't have the best interests of America in mind. So it doesn't really surprise me that he is then pushing back on this movement to really hold the criminal justice system even more accountable. I think the president has, of course, expressed empathy, and he did meet with some members of families who were killed at the hands of police officers or vigilantes. So my understanding is that there were some families who thought maybe he heard their cries and would change and would in some way enact things that they could be proud of. I mean, he did enact the First Step Act. He signed that into law. That was a criminal justice reform legislation that was bipartisan. But I'm not surprised in particular that the president is lashing out at protesters, because that's the way that he got elected.
And you are particularly in this area, unlike other White House correspondents, you're out in the field a lot, you've covered this, you call yourself a civil rights journalist. It's been a motivating part of your journalism career. Does that make it more challenging to cover this story, more motivating for you?
It makes it more motivating because I love that at PBS, I can be at the White House, I can be in the Rose Garden, I can do the kind of on the lawn, classic traditional White House reporting, but then I can also go out in the field. So I've been to Mexico to cover the president's immigration policies. I've been to Pennsylvania and Wisconsin to talk to everyday voters about race and about the pandemic and about climate change. And then of course, in the White House, I can go into the gates of the White House with my hard pass and cover something and cover a briefing. And then by that night at 7 o'clock, I can be out talking to protesters about what they think about the person who's living behind those gates and the president. So I think for me, it's a unique role. It's a role that I really cherish because I really feel like at my heart, I'm someone who's a living room reporter. I love being in people's living rooms and talking to ordinary people about what they think. It grounds my reporting for me. It makes me think that when I'm thinking of the questions that I want to ask the president, I'm thinking about the protesters and the mothers who lost their children, who are all in the back of my mind as I craft my questions.
The other a big issue I want to talk about before we go to questions is the notion about integrity and what might happen in the election. I mean, as the allegations you mentioned about the president, the question about so many people voting by absentee ballot, it's possible we might not have an election day or even an election week as we wait for all these returns to come in. There have been speculations about what the president might do even in those days to try to question the integrity of the system even more. What do you think the obligation of the press will be during those days?
It will be to tell the truth. It will be to say, this race has not been called officially. That we're still counting votes. This has now gone to the courts. Whatever it is, that will be the way that the way that we will report it will have to be based in fact. So if the president declares victory, but the AP and all the other elections watchers, as well as the pollsters themselves and the people, I guess, rather the local officials running all of the elections, if they have not called the election, then the president saying that he was reelected will not mean anything until it's officially called that way. So I think I think at the NewsHour, we've definitely been very understanding of the idea that we're explaining to people that we might not have an election result on November 3rd.
So the debate is tonight. You've seen this president up close. We've seen stories in the press that it could be particularly a brawl, maybe even particularly nasty. Any sense just how nasty could it be?
It's going to be nasty. It's going to be personal. President Trump is really interested in making this a personal fight and going after not only Joe Biden, but his son, Hunter Biden. The president has already suggested that Joe Biden should take a drug test before, because he thinks possibly there must be some performance enhancing drug that would be able to help Joe Biden do better in the debate. It's also, I think, really interesting to see how the styles of the two men. Joe Biden, from our understanding, has been doing traditional debate prep, been thinking through his answers, been practicing his answers. President Trump, based on my reporting, has done very little traditional debate prep. He has, from my understanding, done less than 2 hours, and he's been using some debate flashcards to kind of understand and get a little comfortable with it. But from my understanding, the president feels like his own instincts, his own gut, the way that he got elected in the first place, right? The fact that he didn't listen to all the Republican consultants who told him, don't talk about race, don't talk about immigration. He feels like he knows best how to win this election. So he's really going to be going with that tonight.
And I don't want to make you a psychologist, but there's been a lot of questions about what's the best way to deal with President Trump in circumstances like that? Is it to fire back? Is it to kind of do a Ronald Reagan, well, there you go again? Any sense about how the president might respond to Joe Biden?
I'm not sure. I think that the president is going to respond in personal ways, and I think it will be up to Joe Biden to figure out what the best strategy is. My understanding is that there is going to be, of course, it's likely going to come up that the president had this blockbuster New York Times story about him come out about the fact that he paid, according to the New York Times, $750 in federal taxes in 2016 and another $750 in 2017. My understanding, based on our reporting just this morning at the NewsHour, is that every time that the president gets a question about that, he's going to try to turn it back and ask questions about Hunter Biden and ask questions about the finances of the Biden family. So I think that the president is gearing up and understands that he's going to have to answer some real questions. Of course, Chris Wallace, the debate moderator, is a really great journalist. He's had some really good interviews with President Trump and other White House officials. So we can expect that there's going to be a fair debate and that Joe Biden's going to have to figure out how to deal with President Trump at times deflecting and not answering the questions. But also the same thing with President Trump. He's going to want to point out when Joe Biden isn't answering the questions. If Joe Biden says, you stood up and held a Bible upside down in front of the church, we've heard a lot of Democrats say that the president did not hold a Bible upside down in front of the church. He did hold up a Bible in a way that some people found to be awkward. But there are little details like that the president could pick at and say, well, Joe Biden's not being honest either.
Are you surprised that for all this tumultuous election year and the issues we've talked about, if you believe the polls, the country doesn't seem to be moving very much. The gap seems to be both state by state and nationally. Do you believe that to be true, and does it surprise you?
I think there are a lot of people who definitely made their minds up in 2015 and remain in that same camp in 2020. So if you look at the argument that Democrats are making against President Trump, if you listen to the Democratic National Convention, they were making the argument not just that President Trump's policies are not the right policies for America, or that he endangered American lives by not responding to the coronavirus in the correct way, but they were making a case that he's just not a good man, that he's not decent, that he should not be trusted, that he is all in it for himself, that he is wanting to profit off the presidency. Those are the same arguments that Hillary Clinton made in 2016, of course, without the actual facts of how he would be as president, because obviously now there's 4 years of record for Democrats to point to. But fundamentally, if you believe that President Trump is not a decent person, you probably were not supporting him anyways. And if you're somebody, I've interviewed a lot of Trump supporters who believe that the president has lower expectations and lower standards because they see him as a reality TV president. They don't expect him to be polished. They don't expect him to be someone who tells the truth all the time. They expect him to exaggerate, because they see him as a reality television person who was exaggerating and not telling them the truth. And they still liked him. They think of him as funny and entertaining. They think of him as someone who is like the everyday person in their family. But I will say that there is, based on the polling that I was looking at just this morning, there is a movement in some key battleground states. You look at Michigan, Pennsylvania, you look at white suburban women. There is, at least according to the polls, a real push and support toward Biden. He's leading in a number of states and leading nationally. But in some ways, I talked to a lot of Democratic pollsters, but also Democratic voters who are worried about following the polls and who, after 2016, are saying, let's get ready and vote, and we'll just figure out what this race really was after the fact.
I'm going to turn to some questions here because we'll get as many as we can. The first one says, if Trump loses and declares the election a fraud, how could he likely be removed forcibly from office?
I think we haven't seen I understand why that question is important and, of course, on a lot of people's minds. We just haven't seen it happen in America. So we can say, oh, the military, there are a lot of people who are saying, well, the military would remove him, or he would have to go, or the party would abandon him. But we actually don't know what that looks like in American democracy if someone refuses to leave office, right? I'm Haitian. My parents fled a dictator. So we're very familiar in Haiti of what it looks like when someone doesn't want to leave office and it becomes a dictatorship. But there are a lot of people who think that could never possibly happen in America. I've been talking to some election international observers who are saying, don't ever say ever. Don't ever say that something can't happen in America. So I think we'll just have to see what that actually looks like. But I think if he actually said, I will not leave office, and everyone, including Democrats and Republicans and reporters and everyone agreed that he had lost the election, that he would have to be forced from office in some way.
Next question is, Yamiche, you have faced obstacles as a journalist who is a Black woman during your trajectory in schools and industry. Any thoughts on the state of reparations for Black America, and does this movement in time of COVID help that movement?
I don't have a personal opinion that I would share about reparations, but there has been some really, really smart reporting on reparations. I would tell people to look at Ta-Nehisi Coates, of course, groundbreaking essay, The Case for Reparations, but also Nicole Hannah-Jones wrote an essay really, really good in the New York Times Magazine that's also about reparations. In terms of facing challenges as a Black woman, of course, I think every African-American person that I've ever talked to has experienced racism in some form or fashion, has experienced aggressions or microaggressions. I've been told, I remember at one internship, that I just didn't look the part. I didn't look confident enough, even though I was getting front page stories in the paper. I've also been at times, one person thought I was there to fix the vending machine when I was working at a newspaper, even though I was wearing a suit. I mean, there are so many times where sources or people in the building have looked at me and thought I was either too young or I was not in the right position because I was an African American and they discounted me. But I think all of those experiences have unfortunately made me a stronger person, while also made me attuned to all of the ways that America is still flawed, because there are a lot of people who look at me and think she couldn't possibly have worked at the New York Times, because that's not what a New York Times reporter looks like. She couldn't possibly have two parents that have PhDs because they came from Haiti. They must be these refugees who had no education, when in fact my family is pretty educated and both my parents have PhDs. I joke with people that I have less education than my parents because I have a master's degree. So I think that there are a lot of misconceptions of what it means to be African American, what it means to be an immigrant, and I've seen them play out in my own life personally, for sure.
Emily, who's on screen, can you ask the next question?
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for joining us. My question is, how do you manage certain calls for objectivity in journalism when there are times when one side of an argument can be based in lies or racism?
So I think the way that, first of all, that's a really great question, because I think it is a question of, especially this generation of reporters, but I think also this time period. And I think the way that I deal with objectivity is to be fair, but not to give false equivalences. So when I report on climate change, I don't say, well, one person thinks it's not true and the other person thinks it is. What I say is the overwhelming science shows that the climate is changing, and scientists mostly agree that this is what is happening. There is this small subsect of people, including the president, who don't believe that. So I think, really, one thing that someone I was on TV with said, that don't talk about the belief in climate change, talk about the acceptance of climate change, and using that language to say, well, does this person accept that the climate is changing? Little things like that, to me, are important and show the nuances. Also, I'll say the subject of racism, I believe racism is fundamentally wrong. I believe that Black people fundamentally should not be getting killed at 2.5 to 3 times the weight of white people. I don't think that Black people are fundamentally more criminal than other races. So as a result, I think that we need to look at the criminal justice system and say, how are we treating African Americans in a way that is not fair? I think that we can, obviously, I've interviewed people that are police officers. I've interviewed George Zimmerman's brother. I've interviewed all sorts of people who have different views. So I think that I can incorporate that into my reporting. But I think the one thing I don't want to do is make this ever give the stance or give the feeling that America is some utopia and that everyone's being treated equally, because we just know that that's simply not true.
Thank you. Naomi, you're next.
Hi, thank you for talking to us today. I had a quick question. What is a behind-the-scenes secret about campaigns and campaign reporting?
What's a behind-the-scenes secret?
Yeah. Like something the public,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, something the public like wouldn't know if they were just watching a debate or something.
I mean, I think that, I don't know if there's a behind the scenes secret. I will say that I think we get to know each other a lot, and we get to in some ways be friendly with each other. And I think that can be the case on either side. So I've covered, like I said, the Bernie Sanders campaign. I also covered the Trump campaign. I'm friendly with folks on both campaigns in some ways, because you spend so much time with people that you learn to just kind of see the humanity in each other. So you think about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia, right? You work with someone on the Supreme Court long enough, you're going to share a meal with them, and you're going to see a bit more about their humanity, despite whatever opinions you both might have. So I think maybe that's something that people don't get as much. The president obviously has attacked journalists and targeted me and called me nasty. But the president has also said, hey, you're that famous girl on TV, or that's a really great question. He smiled at me. So I think that as much as the narrative can be that the president kind of lashes out at the media, the president also fundamentally knows a lot of people's names. He respects the New York Times because he constantly continues to talk to them. So he really also is very interested in the media. He was Bob Woodward, when he interviewed him some 19 times or 18 times. At one point he was on the phone with Bob Woodward, and he was bragging to someone, hey, I'm on the phone with Bob Woodward. So he obviously respects Bob Woodward and respects the media. So I think that maybe I don't know if it's a secret, but it's something that I think can maybe not be as obvious when you watch on TV.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Next question is from Katrina.
Hi, Yamiche. I have been looking forward to this all week, and I'm one of your biggest fans, actually. I'm the director of the Africana Center here at Tufts, and we work with students of African descent to support them, advocate for them. And we are often talking to them about the sense of Black people and our resilient nature, that we are able to endure lots of the things that you've been talking about, but we have to somehow maintain a sense of hopefulness. And so I'm wondering if you have any words that you can share with our students based on all of your experiences. How do you maintain that sense of hopefulness that we will be able to get through this current environment?
I think I maintain that sense by taking care of myself and by naming when I'm not having a good day and by naming when I'm feeling anxious or when I'm feeling hurt or when I'm feeling nervous. So I think we can be going, especially I would say as a Black woman. I think in my household, in my culture, as someone who was raised by a single mother, my mom had this kind of go. And I really didn't see my mom struggle outwardly when I was growing up, only after when I was maybe 30 years old and my mom started confiding in me on the feeling of struggle and the real fear of what it's like to raise two kids on a social worker salary in Miami. So I think that it's allowing yourself to be vulnerable with other people has been really important to me in 2020, allowing yourself to cry with other people. I've been open about the fact that like there are stories that make me cry. There are assignments where after I do them, I feel really sad and I go and I drink a cup of coffee or a glass of wine or I take a walk or I take a long bath. I've really been trying to be gentle with myself, which means that on days when I feel like not going to work, I ask for a day off. I think it can be really hard because we're all on this kind of, we can be all on this hamster wheel where you have to, especially in college, you have 5 clubs you're going to, you have all these classes, you're learning how to navigate and get a degree virtually while also missing your friends, while also missing your family. Maybe you're that kid who's on campus because you couldn't go home because you don't have a home to go back to. I have friends that were homeless who went to Georgetown, who lived at the university. That was their residence. I remember having to go to Thanksgiving with my college best friend because my parents could not afford for me to go home for Thanksgiving. My mom couldn't afford it. So I think leaning on your social systems, leaning on your friends, on your family to really be real with them when you feel worried or when you feel scared, and turning off the television. I'm a television reporter. I love watching the news, but there are times where I have to turn it off, where I have to go and listen to some Bill Weathers and dance around my apartment. And I think if you don't allow yourself to just feel your feelings, and instead of running from them and hiding them in work, that you will eventually have to confront them, and it will be in a way that might lead to a nervous breakdown. I have friends that have absolutely suffered all sorts of breakdowns, and if you're not real with yourself and saying this is hurting me and I'm not resilient or strong today, then it will eat you up.
Philip, you're next. Philip, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, hi. It's Tufts alum in New York, the Office of the Public Advocate. Yamiche, a huge fan, and thank you for the service as a journalist to the country. And I asked the question actually already for the reparations, so I'd absolutely be happy for someone else to ask a question and so forth.
Thank you, Philip. Let me, Yamiche, let me ask you this because I think we're running out of time. Phil, I don't want to cut you off. Are you? Okay. Yamiche, let me ask you this. For young aspiring journalists out there who say, I want to be the next Yamiche, you've talked about the work-life balance and having a sense of that. What advice would you give a young journalist?
The first thing I would say is don't be the next Yamiche, be yourself. I love having mentors. I love reading about the lives of Gwen Ifill and Judy Woodruff and so many other people that came before me, but I'm not trying to be them. And you will run yourself ragged trying to be someone else. So I would never have worn my hair natural and thought that I would get a job on TV if I had been looking at some of the people who came before me. So I think it really means embracing yourself, understanding what really makes you tick, what really makes you want to be a journalist. So for me, I always tell people in every job that ever hired me, I'm a civil rights reporter. You can put me on transportation, you can put me on education, you can put me at the White House. I'm gonna still write about injustice in some way. That doesn't mean every story is gonna be about that, because I'm gonna obviously write about the economy. And I was in Helsinki when the president was talking to the president of Russia and all of the other foreign policy things. But fundamentally, the lens that I do my work through is a lens through social justice and vulnerable populations. So I think for me, it's about finding out what makes you tick. Do you really want to be a fashion reporter? Robin Givhan at the Washington Post is an amazing fashion reporter. And she talks about fashion in a way that makes you want to read it. So I don't like reading about fashion normally, but I read almost everything that she writes because she writes about it in such a good way. My husband was a sports reporter. Now he's a local politics reporter. So also allowing yourself to do different jobs. He loves covering sports, but in this moment, for the last couple of years, he's really found it smart and he's found it fulfilling to write about all of the different things that are impacting people's lives and in terms of their access to the prosperity that we see in America. So I think really just like really charting your own course. Of course, you can follow other people's courses. I can talk to you about making sure you get a bunch of mentors and have people that really support you, being willing to move. I moved, I think 6 to 7 times in the last 10 years because I was always open to a new opportunity, always open to moving to a new job if it meant that I would have a step up or be in a newsroom that I think would help my growth. So I think there's also that being nimble. But I think fundamentally, it's about making sure that this is the right move for you, and believing that journalism, and if you are wanting to be a journalist and you find and you decide that you want to be a journalist, stick through it. My first job, I was not making a lot of money. I was very, very worried about what was going to happen. I had friends that were Wall Street bankers, that were doctors, that were making much more money than me. So I slept on their couches and I ate their food sometimes, but I stuck to my journalism because I knew that that's what I wanted to do. My mom and my dad both wanted me to be a lawyer. But I knew that in my heart that I wanted to be a journalist. So I think really going at it at full force and realizing that it's going to be tough and it's going to be hard, and seek out the people who can encourage you. So I have mentors and mentees, I should say now, young women and men that I'm mentoring, that I say, yeah, it is tough. Yeah, you did not get a lot of sleep. Yeah, it is. It means that you're talking to an editor that maybe doesn't want to run the 5 stories that you just pitched. So now you got to write about dead whales. I did that when I was on Long Island. I ran I drove 2 hours to cover a story about lost puppies. I mean, there's so many things that you might have to do in journalism before you get to a job that makes you feel like this is the one that I've been waiting for. But I think sticking with it is really, really key.
Well, I'd say, speaking for the country, I'm so glad you slept on those couches and you went through your share of whale stories and lost puppies, because we're all the better for it. So thank you so much for taking the time for us. I thank everybody for joining us, and thanks again to you, Yamiche, and wish you all a great day. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.